just taking a basic information from you, like your history in construction, like how knowledgeable are you in terms of what's your background in construction?
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm an architect.
Mm-hmm.
I trained in Adelaide, but I worked in Adelaide and London and Sydney as an architect
Okay.
for about 14 years. But I stopped working as an architect in 1992, so it's been a while since I've worked in practice.
All right.
Since then, I've worked for master specification organisations in Sydney and in the United Kingdom,
Okay.
producing master specifications. So that's a sort of specialist sideline and classification systems. And since 2014, I've been a lecturer here.
All right.
So yes, so my expertise on building surveying and the Australian Building Code is limited.
Okay. So as an architect, did you ever use building codes in AI?
Yes, absolutely. You
Okay.
can't design buildings if you don't without compliance.
All right.
But in the time that I was working in the UK, that was the British building codes, not the Australian ones that I was
Alright.
working to.
Yeah.
In Australia, when I was working in Adelaide, that was 77 to 82, so that was an old building code, not the current building code or the NCC. That didn't exist at that time, so
Yeah.
that was a long time ago.
All right.
And in Sydney, that was 82 to, 87 to 92. That's right, 87 to 92 in Sydney. So that was working with the building code of Australia as she was then,
Okay. All right.
but that was a while ago.
Yeah. So architects do need to be knowledgeable.
Oh,
in
of course, you
Okay.
can't comply, but you can't design a building that doesn't
With-
comply. It won't,
alright.
it won't get approved.
Okay.
So when you design a building, you have to submit it to council. In those days,
Oh,
it was
yes.
just council,
All right.
and we didn't have private certifiers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You'd submit it to council for approval.
Mm-hmm.
We did use a consulting on one project that I had. I was working in Sydney, but we were doing a project in Queensland. We asked a local expert, a building surveyor actually, to give us advice on compliance for the project
Okay.
during the design phase.
All right.
And so he was working as a consultant, and we asked him to, it was some student housing, and we asked him to check our design for compliance. And he raised a whole load of things which we fixed.
Yeah.
And then we submitted it to the council. We submitted it to the council in Queensland, and they first of all they said they weren't interested because it was for a university, which is federally funded, and there is a feeling that university projects don't need to comply because they're federally funded.
Okay.
Don't need to comply with the NCC. Then the council thought that they did need to check it, and then they decided it didn't comply.
All right.
So we'd been told by one building surveyor that it complied, and then we were told by the council that it didn't comply. I had another experience like that in Sydney. We were doing another building for a university, the University of Sydney,
Yeah.
and at first the council didn't want to know about it, and we designed it and we interpreted the building code in a way that we thought our building complied. And then the council decided they were interested, and they decided that our building didn't comply.
Okay.
So we had to redesign in both cases we had to redesign the building completely.
Yeah. To be compliant.
To be
with the-
compliant. So compliance with the code is very important to
Okay.
architects.
All right.
And you do the best you can, but clearly what you find, what you've seen, what I've learned from those experiences is that different experts will interpret the code in different ways. So
Yeah.
there's no such thing as a single right answer. One person might think you comply, and another person might think you
You
don't.
don't. That's true.
It shouldn't be like that. It should be nice and clear,
Uh,
but it is like that.
okay. All right. So we understand. Yes, your knowledge is a bit limited in the individual.
It's old.
It's all in
It's
the
all-
in the individual codes, but we'd appreciate any thoughts you'd have. In,
Sure,
yeah.
I'll do the best I can.
All right.
Okay.
So we'll start with the access and egress codes.
Yeah. Are you satisfied with the existing NCC provisions for the design of access and egress? If not, why not?
Am I satisfied with them?
Yeah.
Okay. Strictly speaking, no. One of the things with the building codes is that they, over the years, every few years, every 3 years in Australia, they get tightened up a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there'll always be pressure to tighten them and improve them. So they can always be improved, and they will continue to be improved forever, I think.
Okay.
So in that sense, I'm not satisfied with them, and I'm hoping that next time they get better, and next time they get better still. one of the things we find with Disability Act, with access, is that a long time ago, I mean, it wasn't in the NCC at all. And actually, a long time ago, people weren't interested in it. They just ignored it as an issue completely. Except for some specialist projects like hospitals and things like that, where you have to design hospitals for people who are in wheelchairs, because otherwise the hospital won't work.
That's true.
But for ordinary commercial buildings, public buildings, people didn't bother a long time ago. And then it became, some standards were developed which were not mandatory at all. They weren't called up in any building codes, but standards were developed for design for disabled access. There were a whole load of books published about it, and a lot of architects took it quite seriously and advocated it to their clients. But of course it cost money, and a lot of clients, because it wasn't mandatory, a lot of clients weren't interested unless they could be persuaded that it was the right thing to do. So what eventually happened is it got into the building code because not enough buildings were being designed for it. And so the disability lobby persuaded the government to put it into the building code here and in the UK and elsewhere in the world. And so now it's in. But what you find is the level that's required in the building code and the level that's described in the guidance documents is different. Guidance documents are setting a much higher standard than the building code does. So there's always room for improvement, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, and the NCC provisions for emergency egress do not cover disabled people. And how should this be dealt with in the future?
Okay.
I think.
The NCC is interesting because it doesn't cover everything anyway.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things it's not interested in, and it only sets bare minimum standards. If that's true, and I don't know if it's true or not because I'm not familiar with the code, then it should. If we have access for disabled people, we should have egress for disabled people as well. There's no point in letting them into the building if they can't get out again if there's a fire.
I know.
So that if that's the case, that's not logical, and so they should be able to come in through the same ways go out through the same route that they got in. So if they came in through a ramp and in through a door that was easily opened, they should be able to go out the same way. There are issues though with disability comes in lots of different forms. There are blind people and there are deaf people. So when you have an alarm going off in the building, that's designed for able-bodied people to hear it. But if you're deaf, what happens? You can't hear the alarm. So how do we notify deaf people in the building that there's a fire or an incident? So there are a lot of things like that need to be thought about. So I would have thought that a disabled person who's at least mobile and can hear and see should be able to get out the same way they got in. That should be all right. One of the problems is that for disabled access in buildings, a lot of it relies on lifts to go vertically. And of course you cannot use lifts in a fire. They're not designed for it. So that means that a disabled person could be stranded on a floor. And the same happens in hospitals actually. So you end up designing in what are called refuges. So these are rooms that are fireproof rooms that people can get into. So they can't leave their floor because they're in a hospital bed, they're on life support, or they're disabled or something like that. And they're transferred instead into these refuges where they can hopefully survive the fire.
Are there such rooms?
Without actually getting out of the building.
I
So
haven't heard about such rooms.
No, they're not common. They're used in multi-story hospitals and things like that. They're not ideal. They're not guaranteed to work. So it's a big issue getting disabled people out of the building. There are lots of things to think about. And the NCC only ever sets minimum requirements anyway, and it's not going to describe best practice, it's only going to describe bare minimum practice. And it has to be cost effective. So if you only get, if this building, for example, has got no lifts, this building. So if you're disabled, how many disabled people do we have in this building? The answer is very, very few. So is it worth putting in special provisions to get disabled people out in this building? Is it justified? And the answer is probably not. So you have to make a cost-benefit decision, and the NCC does that. Whenever they make changes to the NCC, they look at cost versus benefit. There's no point imposing a big cost on the community if there's not really much benefit. So anyway, and typically this happens when we have a fire. So if we had a fire and a whole lot of disabled people got killed, then suddenly there'd be a big furore and we'd have to put new requirements into the NCC to get disabled people out. But it'll probably take a fire that kills people before we get any change of that kind.
Okay. Other than this, how do you think the NCC access and egress provisions might develop in the future?
Well, they're going to get tighter, I think. So we also have in Australia, we have a thing called the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act, which is a general purpose act that deals with all discrimination against disabled people, but it requires a disabled person to take action against the building owner. So if they feel they've been unfairly dealt with, they can sue the building owner under that act. It's nothing to do with the NCC, it's to do with the DDA instead.
Okay.
And that's been running for quite a long time, and I don't know how this works, but there will be case law. You know, courts will have found there will have been cases in court, and that will have built up a set of precedents. Do you know what I mean by precedents?
Yeah.
So the idea is, what I would think is if there's enough of these precedents now, somebody should look at them, look at all these cases and see if any of these cases should be, lessons from those cases should be transferred into the NCC. Or not, I don't know. So that's one possibility for upgrading the NCC, is to look at case law under the Disability Discrimination Act.
Okay.
So, let's turn to the energy efficiency.
Yes,
Yeah.
my favourite subject.
Yes.
Not your favourite subject.
Yeah. Yes.
You don't look that enthusiastic.
In whole building code, maybe
Okay.
it's my favorite subject. Yeah, it's given the increasing reliance on renewable energy to think the NCC energy efficiency provision are fair in every state, especially in South Australia and Tasmania.
Okay. Yeah, I understand that. I understand that question completely. The NCC has provisions regarding this, which are the same right across the country, in every state and territory, and it's all to do. The objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so carbon dioxide emissions. The thing is, on the energy sector. So the idea is that buildings are responsible for a lot of energy consumption, and therefore they're responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's completely relevant where the energy is supplied by burning fossil fuels, because that's where the greenhouse gas emissions come from. So if you've got coal-fired power stations supplying energy, and you've got a building over here gobbling that energy up, that building is effectively spitting out carbon dioxide from that power station. If in South Australia and Tasmania, for example, the power is not being supplied by coal-fired power stations, but it's being supplied by solar or wind or hydroelectricity or something like that, then the building consuming that power is not generating lots of greenhouse gas emissions. So, in other words, it doesn't matter what the NCC says, the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings in South Australia are going down. And yet we still have to comply in South Australia with these requirements, which are becoming less relevant here. So the more we move towards renewables, the more irrelevant the requirements in the NCC are. So in some states they're very relevant. So New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland use an awful lot of black coal to power their buildings. So greenhouse gas emissions are a big issue there for buildings. In South Australia and Tasmania, and even the ACT now, it's much less of an issue. So I think what should happen is that the NCC should have a provision which allows which recognises the energy mix in the different states. So if you've got an energy mix which is substantially fossil fuel, then the provisions apply. If you've got an energy mix that is substantially renewable, then you don't have to comply with the provisions. That would be fairer. And there probably needs to be some kind of a transition from full compliance to zero compliance to 50% compliance. That sort of, there needs to be some sort of grading depending on the energy mix. I think. You might not agree.
Which aspect of the NCC energy efficiency provision is the most important, you think, and why?
Which aspect of the NCC energy efficiency provisions is the most important and why? Okay. Some of the energy efficiency provisions are important, not just, although they specifically say we are in here for greenhouse gas emission reduction, actually they're about thermal comfort.
Yeah.
But they don't mention thermal comfort. That's not an objective. The objective is greenhouse gas emissions. I think that a lot of those requirements actually should continue to apply into the future for comfort, because we're warming up, our summers are going to get hotter and our buildings are going to get less comfortable. And we will have, especially very young people, like little babies and elderly people, will die from heat stress if we don't make our buildings thermally comfortable. So a lot of the requirements in the NCC about energy efficiency are to do with things like insulation, but it's only in there, it says, for greenhouse gas emission reductions. It's not in there for human comfort and human safety. I think they should change that so that. So I think the things that are relevant for human survival, for thermal stress, things like that, should stay. They're very important, but they've got nothing to do with greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. And do you think the greenhouse gas emission case by the building has declined since the NGC energy efficiency provision were introduced in Australia?
Do I think the greenhouse gas emissions have declined? Yes, they have. I think you'd be able to find that out, I think, by actually doing some research on what the greenhouse gas emissions were 20 years ago and what they are now. One of the problems is that I don't know how much of this can be put down to the NCC itself, because, for example, we've been changing our energy supply mix to renewables here, not because of what the NCC says, but just because of government policy. So the state government, the Labor government we had before this one, was funding people to put solar panels on their roofs. It had nothing to do with the NCC. It was to do with government policy. So I think the emissions have gone down, especially in places like South Australia and so on, with lots of solar. And to be fair, solar and wind are going up in all the other states as well. And all of that will bring greenhouse gas emissions down. But I don't know how much of that reduction is to do with the NCC and how much of it is to do with general government policy promoting the use of renewable energy. Okay? So that's an interesting question.
After the 2014 La Crosse fire in Melbourne and the 2017 Grenfell fire in London, the ABCB, Australian Building Codes Board, changed the NCC Volume 1. The change required that buildings of Type A and Type B must be constructed with non-combustible cladding. The Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal found the building certifier involved in the La Crosse Tower construction to be partly responsible for the fire. Do you think that has had any effect in the way private certifiers or building surveyors would assess buildings? Or?
Okay, that decision I think is fairly recent.
Yeah.
It hasn't really had time to fall out, but there's a lot of concern that private certifiers operate partly because they have what's called professional indemnity insurance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now, in this case, if the courts have found that a building certifier is partly liable for a fire, nobody died, I don't think, but still, then they have to pay out a lot of money. The insurers have to pay out a lot of money, which means the insurance premiums go up across the board.
Okay.
So the cost of being a private building certifier is going up.
All right.
And the feeling seems to be that the private building certifier may be under threat. Because of the cost of insurance, and because of the number of cases like this. We haven't had fires, but in New South Wales, in South Australia, in Victoria, the governments have done surveys of buildings that have got this cladding on them.
Right.
And there are, like in South Australia, there are maybe 30. Who's to blame, and how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah.
And again, probably we'll have to find the building certifiers partly responsible.
Okay.
In the case of the Grenfell Tower, that building, it was a council-owned building, and the council's own building certifiers approved it. And there's a conflict of interest there, because the council owns the building and the council certifiers approved it. So no one's policing it properly. Because of that conflict of interest.
Okay.
So even council certifiers have got a problem. So private certifiers have a problem because of insurance. Council certifiers have a problem with conflict of interest. In some cases.
Okay.
So there are problems for building certifiers in this area because of these fires, and everyone's going to have to be It's a bee. Don't worry about them. They're harmless. They're
Okay.
completely harmless. Normally, can I just take them out? Because normally I that's why the window's open, and that's why I have this little jar here. Is to take him out. 'Cause they can't find the opening, which is there. You go. They have they nest up there in my wall.
Okay.
So yeah, I get quite a few of them coming in here.
Okay.
But they don't hurt. They're a native bee. They're no
Going to
problem.
be stinged and.
No, they don't sting.
Okay. And do you think there will be any significant changes in cladding systems?
Oh, there already are. So for example, these 30 buildings in South Australia are going to have to, at some point, be reclad
All right.
with a material that's regarded, or a product that's regarded as much safer.
All right.
So the usage of that particular cladding, the aluminium sandwich panel,
Yeah.
it's a very thin, sandwich panel with aluminium facing and plastic insides.
Yeah.
The usage of that will decline.
All right.
It's a very handy material, that's why
Yeah.
it was used, but it's too dangerous.
Okay. So for as an architect, are there systems? Did you use mostly combustible? In your knowledge, are combustible cladding systems used?
No, strictly no, they're not supposed to be. The
Alright.
building code says you're not supposed to use them.
Okay.
The building code actually says you're not supposed to use this stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the problems is that it's been used, even though the building code says it shouldn't be used. So that's the problem. And who's responsible there? Is it the certifiers for approving a non-compliant material?
All right.
Is it the architects for specifying a non-compliant material?
All right.
Is it the builders for substituting a non-compliant material again? So maybe a complying material was specified,
Okay.
but it's too expensive, so the builder replaced it with something cheaper,
All right.
which doesn't comply. So, the blame for these 30 buildings in South Australia will be different. It might be the architect's fault for this one, builder's fault for that one, building certifiers for this one, and maybe some shared blame for some of the others. It's going to vary from project to project.
All right. Okay. Fire protected timber was adopted in 2016, NCC 2016. This allows multi-story buildings up to 25 meters in effective height to be constructed using fire protected timber. What has been the reception of this provision, or what do you think?
Okay, well, as an architects love it. For tall buildings, up until recently, the only choices were steel or concrete.
Yeah.
For tall buildings, and mostly they were done in concrete. The ones over the road here are all in concrete.
Yeah.
So it's really good to have another material choice.
Okay. Is timber cheaper?
Well, that's the idea. The idea is
Right.
timber is cheaper.
All right.
It's also renewable.
Okay.
You can plant more timber. You can't plant more concrete, and you can't plant more steel, but you
Alright.
can plant more timber. So it's
Okay.
renewable in that sense.
Yeah.
Processing of timber, it requires a lot less energy than producing concrete and producing steel.
Oh,
So
right.
the embodied carbon of the structure is much less than it is for steel structures or concrete structures.
Okay.
It's at the end of life, when you demolish the building, you can reuse the timber, you can dispose of the timber, it'll rot,
Yeah.
whereas steel doesn't rot, concrete
Oh.
doesn't rot.
Sure.
So there are lots and lots and lots of advantages
Okay.
to because the bulk of the waste of a building, when you demolish a building, the bulk of the building pile of rubble is the structure.
Yeah.
If it's steel, that's a lot of steel. Steel can be recycled, so that's good. Concrete, not much you can do with it. You can crush it into aggregate and use it as landfill and things like that. Timber, if you need to, you can dispose of it,
Yeah.
and it'll rot,
Okay.
which is great. That means it will release because it sequesters carbon when it grows, the
Alright.
tree.
Okay.
When it rots, of course, it releases the carbon again. It's not so good, but it was a loan of carbon, if you like. So no, there are lots of advantages to it. So a lot of examples of these high-rise timber frame buildings using cross-laminated timber are going up now in Australia, in Europe, in North America.
Okay.
It's architects like it,
All right.
and they would have done it sooner if they'd been permitted to do it sooner.
Alright.
So it's only because they're allowed to do it
Okay.
that they can. So again, this is the NCC
Yeah.
dictating design.
All right.
So up until very recently, this was simply not permitted.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks.
NCC 2019 removed the requirements of fire hydrant poster protection for sprinkler protection building and added the alternative protection for fire hydrant poster located between 3.5 meter and 10 meters from the building they protect. In your opinion, why did the ABCA make these changes?
I have no idea. So this is one of those things that I just don't know. Debbie will be able to give you a good
Yeah,
answer about that, because she deals with fire engineering, but I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. So I can't help you. Unlike the other questions, which I can talk a bit about, I don't know about that one.
Okay, for class 2 and class 3 building, NCCA 2000 requires building in these classes over 4 stories and under 25 meters effective height to have sprinkler protection system. In your opinion, was there a need for this provision, and will this provide more protection?
It should do. Sprinkler provision in smaller buildings is sprinklers are expensive. There is a case, for example, for putting sprinklers into residential buildings. So we have residential sprinkler systems, and one of the questions is, should that be mandated in the NCC or not? Because they're expensive. And in smaller buildings they're expensive. So they've always been required in big buildings, but in smaller buildings maybe they're not necessary. But there are a lot more smaller buildings than there are big ones. It's like a pyramid with the big ones at the top and the smaller ones in the middle here. So there are a lot of buildings that sort of size that are not protected properly, you could argue. They can't protect themselves. They require the fire brigade to squirt water all over the place. So it's probably better. I'm speaking from ignorance because I don't really know, but this is not going to. This has got to be better. The question is it worth the cost? Given that not every building burns down, not every building has a fire, but every building is going to have a sprinkler system. So every building is going to have to pay for a sprinkler system that it may never use. So this is this cost-benefit problem. So we're forcing the cost of a sprinkler system on every building of that size, but only 1 in 200, 1 in 1,000 will ever need it because of the fire. The rest won't burn. So it's a difficult one. It's definitely going to make it safer, but it's going to make it more expensive as well for everybody. So that's one of those challenges that the NCC has in it, and it'll be interesting to see what the other people say about this in terms of cost benefit. Typically, these things happen when, for example, the Grenfell Tower changes in the code are happening because of the Grenfell Tower fire and the La Crosse fire, in which building was destroyed or damaged and people's lives were lost. And as I said before, typically that seems to be necessary before you can raise the standards in the NCC. You need to have a really bad incident to trigger improvement. So these changes that you're talking about may well have come about because of a fire somewhere that people thought, oh dear, we should fix up the NCC to sort of make sure this never happens again. But I don't know the history, so I don't know what caused those changes. But it's very probably was a fire somewhere that caused those changes, because it's expensive. But I don't know. So Debbie and Rob will know much more about those two questions than I do. Okay?
Okay. All right. Thanks for your time.
You're very welcome.
We'll be ending the interview now.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 4 interviews, goodness.